Okay, well, welcome back, pop culture nerds. On this episode of Digital Section, we're doing something a little different. Normally, we've had a pretty good rhythm of like movies and video game reviews, and some schmegma there. I think, for lack of a better term, maybe potpourri is the better term.
Oh yeah.
Just something like that run Jeopardy category. No one goes for in Celebrity Jeopardy until the last possible second. Yeah, but we're mixing it up, and today we're talking about something that was big in the video game industry for quite a while. It was a huge staple in it, and then a few years ago, died, never to return again.
I was going to say, Joe, instead of reviewing video games, we'll be reviewing things that talked about video games coming out, which is a little bit different. But it is weird to think about this, Joe, that for a time, E3 was a brand new concept. It was a thing that hit the ground running. It seemed like it had plenty of momentum. And then, as you mentioned, it dies off. And so we'll get into some of the reasons for that. But, Joe, I think for the right audience, though, they may not even know what E3 is now, given that it's been 3 years since the last one.
And even like my frame of reference that I remember like thinking of talking about when we were plotting the episode was that I remember how E3 got this huge hype from the G4 TV network, which also defunct and gone. Tried to make a comeback as a YouTube channel, and also died relatively quick while trying to do that, unfortunately. But I mean, they hyped it up.
G4 live at E3.
Believe it or not, I'm watching E3. I never thought I'd get in so easily.
They had contests where you could actually go to the E3 conference. They would do coverage from there every once in a while. And it was this huge deal on G4 when E3 would hit every year. And I remember enjoying watching the coverage and things that would come out of E3 with any new announcements in the video game world. And that is just, an antiquated idea now.
Well, for many years, I mean, E3 was almost like communion within the Catholic Church. Back then, a long time ago, you couldn't even actually see the communion happening. It was behind a sheet, and you assumed certain things were going on back there. Now, I'm not speaking from personal experience. I'm probably the worst Christian of all time. But when it comes to what was going on with E3, though, it was an invite-only show, and that goes for almost the first 22 years that it was even around. So for a place like E3 to be shown by G4, suddenly it's like, hey, that we're going to pull the curtain back, and now you can get some of that insider info that only the industry gets to know about.
Yeah, because like Mark said, that invite only, you had to have some sort of relationship to the industry back when this started in 1995, or what some people may refer to as the late 20th century. You had to either be in the video game industry, or you had to have a press pass, and that was your only way of getting into this conference. So it had this really big air of exclusivity around to it, where it was, again, when they finally did open it up, I believe in 2019, to where you didn't have to be someone in the industry to make it. It was this incredible experience that you got to actually be a part of, that normally you had to really wait until it was done to hear anything from.
It's really funny how nowadays you see plenty of creators out there who will fake their followings, and they'll fake the amount of views and things that they get just so that they can call themselves an influencer and get into events like this now. Back then, it was a little harder to do that kind of thing, and yeah, we've got to go back though to 1995 to really start to talk about what was going on before E3, because once again, this is a concept that didn't exist and then suddenly was there, and the only other things that were kind of like it at that time was the Consumer Electronics Show and the European Computer Trade Show, which are neither things that I've ever attended. But CES is still around, and actually several years ago I was actually invited to go to CES one year, because I was working in a company that had technologies that could potentially be featured there, blah, blah, blah. But it's I would rather go to E3 compared to, CES. And what's funny about CES was that it obviously was not a trade show made for video games, which seems kind of odd, doesn't it? Because electronic show, don't you think that video games would fall into that, Joe?
You would think they used to have a corner in there somewhere, but really, like, they had that. This was a show that was like electronics in general. So it was you'd think every aspect of it would be represented, but again, gaming was a really, really small part of it. According to Sega America CEO Tom Klaninski, I think is how it's pronounced. Klinsky, yes. Yeah, he said that the CES organizers put us in the way, way back, and you had to walk past all of the porn vendors to find us there. So it was like they were around, but like clearly video games are kind of an afterthought.
Can we take a moment to talk about just how relevant porn can be in emerging technologies? Because I mean, they powered the whole fight versus like HD DVD and like Blu-rays.
I was going to bring that up. Like, does anyone here remember HD DVD? No, you don't, because porn didn't back it, and it died pretty quick.
I was going to say though, like, imagine like you're walking past like the Club Vandersex, tripoded dick machine, and then suddenly there's Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay.
I mean, I'm also going to imagine this is why VHS was picked over Beta. It's probably why that one went out too. I'm saying this completely out of my ass. I have no idea if that's what actually happened. Beta is something that predates both of us, I believe. I think Beta came and died by 85. So I think that was done. VHS already had that stranglehold.
See, and I wouldn't even pretend to understand that technology because, well, that was before I was even in the chamber. So, I mean, yeah. But to that point, though, it is kind of funny how it's like, yeah, porn was more important than video games, which I would say they're on equal footing these days.
I think so.
Maybe.
Internet's around for both of them now.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there's a volley back and forth between relevance on them, but, whatever. But here's the part of this that I considered kind of meaty, Joe, which is actually not that exciting when it comes to E3 and how it was formulated, because I work in an industry, Joe, that has a ton of abbreviations that seemingly the same ones pop up all the time, but they actually have 3 different meanings. And so, oddly enough, video games had the same exact thing kind of going on in the early 90s. But there were some organizations that were trying to help this eventual E3 concept get formed, and one of them would be the International Digital Software Association, which would form actually the year before E3 does. And nowadays, it's actually still existing as the Entertainment Software Association, or ESA. Once again, abbreviations abound here. But the only important things that you really have to know here is that this organization would be tied into fairly closely in terms of fate with the ESRB, when at this same time, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board was basically the video game industry had no ratings. There was no real oversight to what they were putting out. So the government, of course, stepped in, and all the Karens put on their best pantsuits at the time, and they really started to tear apart this industry.
Yeah, thank you, Mortal Kombat, with your lifelike blood flying around the screen all willy-nilly.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But what I really think was the craziest thing that kind of pops out of this, though, is that CES that we just mentioned, they're actually being dicks. They're being very big dicks to video game creators because they're not really willing to concede much of the show to them. And I can't really understand exactly why, because if people are being drawn to your show and video games are a part of that, I don't know why they wouldn't let them have more of a presence. But CES, Joe, they never really did this. They wouldn't let the video games have a bigger part. That's why they're behind the porn people.
I mean, I have to imagine it's like spreadsheets and then porn, and then video games is somewhere further down to them, because that's the software that they crave. Spreadsheets.
Seriously.
And porn.
Seriously.
Yep.
I mean,
you can be a freak in both sheets with those first two, and then the video games, unless it's like the Japanese dating games. Yeah. It's really just the first two with the sheet freakiness.
Hey, you know what? On one side, you've got PC load letter. What the fuck does that mean? And then you've literally got porn, and then you've got video games. But to the point of trying to carve out some more space here, for those of you who remember the Gamepro magazine format, it was created by Pat Farrell long time ago, folks. We're talking in the long, long ago, back when Joe and I were, still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and, not not getting used to our mortality, but that's a separate point. Regardless, GamePro was in bed with International Data Group, otherwise known as IDG, and they successfully ran what I'm assuming was attended by millions of virgins, the Macworld convention, since 1985.
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, do we have Steve Jobs to thank for all of this? Like the whole the tech convention when he just rolls up in his black used turtleneck and then just is here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Look at this thing that looks exactly the same as the last thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and then everyone golf claps. Oh my God.
Whoa! It can do one more thing the last thing couldn't. Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or in some cases, it's just a different color.
Hey.
Yeah.
Joe, the cult of Apple has been around for a very long time, okay? I mean, this is nothing new, but technically, the Macworld convention, I'm not trying to make fun of them for their sexual prowess, of which I'm making some assumptions here, but Joe, that concept is what actually allowed for E3 to start to form, because this relationship between IDG, GamePro, and then eventually some of the industry heads of the video game world, those three get together, man. It's kind of like the meeting of Smith and Wesson, and then suddenly, here we go, man. We're talking about E3. So that's where the Electronic Entertainment Expo forms as a concept. So I don't know, man. As much as I love to make fun of the pocket protector groups out there of the past, I mean, hey, they got some shit done in 1995. So, but as I mentioned to you, Joe, CES, these sons of bitches, they actually were just playing chicken with E3 in the beginning, because what they tried to do when the E3 first gets announced, they're actually trying to put on their same events at the same time.
Just doubling down. Yep, we're going to do the same things. Yep, we're going to just focus on electronics and our porn, and that's going to beat your video games, kids.
Well, suddenly, for years, they don't want to offer spaces to video game creators or brands, whatever you want to call it. But then suddenly, as soon as E3 shows up, they're like, you know what? I think we'll offer you that space now. I mean, hey, Joe, I don't know if you had this on your bingo card when we were talking about how E3 was slowly dying off, but did you think CES would actually be the villain in this story?
Nope, no clue. Would not have guessed that. Mm-mm.
I definitely had no idea that was coming. but hey, just like a lot of bad ideas, though, CES starts to slowly realize, okay, in that formulative period here, that yeah, we've screwed up, and the video game industry, who's literally been asking for this, they're actually favoring the event that they had a hand in creating, which to me it shouldn't actually be that confusing. But
no,
the CES,
that's not terribly bizarre.
no. But hey, dude, I mean, CES, I do not understand why that would be their stance for so long. Is to like basically just let's just fuck with these creators for a while, and then suddenly we want to play ball. It's like,
yeah, I suppose. I don't know if it was just a major hit in attendance, or like suddenly journalists just don't care, and we're like, no, we're not going to cover this. The video games, that's what's hot right now. That's what's selling the papers. So because it's all just a bunch of like old 1930s like journalists just there. Yeah, you want to sell papers? You want to use that yellow journalism, and no one's going to buy it if it doesn't talk about video games, because that's what the kids want. And yeah, you and your spreadsheets, go away. Go away. We're going to E3.
Dude, seriously, the whole concept of it, to me, I feel like there's the sepia tone, coverage of all the footage from E3, and then as you mentioned, these guys have their little bowler hats with the card in the top, and every time there's an announcement, they like run to the payphones, to get back to the cities and talk to them about what's going on. But I mean, really, we do have to remember that we are talking about the year 1995, which, I mean, it's weird to have to give myself a reminder about that, but this is a world that is breathing the first air of like AOL. The majority of the internet is connected within like universities and private institutions. Yeah. It's not this like widespread thing we have now. And so what do you think, Joe, about this concept of like the internet not being here, but then closing off this event to only like trade publications, newspapers? I mean, like how different a world does that feel?
From today, incredibly different. And again, like I said before, I've used the term antiquated because this was the best way to get your information out there. Is that you didn't want to waste space on people who couldn't promote your product. So making it so that you could bring in, some influencers who can say, hey, here's my I've posted like a quick little, basically a list of things to do with this or my best takeaways from this, and now it's on YouTube and millions of people can see it in an instant. You don't have that. So you're going for who can circulate your information the best. And it is just an incredibly different world that exists now from what it was then. So it's both like mind-boggling and also like not to me, because like that's how things were when we were growing up. Is you couldn't get into things unless you knew someone, and now things are just incredibly more open because being more open makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the whole concept to me was interesting because my brother Nate, who's been on this program a few times, he would consistently try to get into like these Microsoft events and some of the new Windows release events, and he would create his own fictional company and take it into these events so he could get a brand new copy of Windows. And what was really funny about E3 though was that my dad was obviously in the military for 30 years, and there was a window there where my dad actually got to go to E3 because they were developing, the Army was developing technology that was video game based, and it was to help soldiers do certain applications that maybe were too dangerous, or maybe they wanted a virtual environment to safely teach these things. And so America's Army ended up being the format of that. And so my dad actually got to go to E3 kind of showcasing some of these demos and integrating with these journalists and these people checking it out. And dude, America's Army was actually viewed as like a crazy popular thing because it obviously didn't just stick with the military. People got their hands on the demos and they're like, this is actually really cool.
Yeah.
So
now I'm just picturing two things going on in my mind with your family right now. On one hand, I'm now going to think it was your dad's idea to be like, hey, we want that supercomputer to be built. Oh, it's too expensive. Let's just hook up 16 PS4s together and call it a day and make it work. And then on the other time is that your brother, trying to get into this Microsoft convention, storms into your house one day and says, if you get a call, you say you're Vandal Industries, and then just runs into the bathroom.
I mean, dude, it's right up there. I mean, granted, that would never happen in this case, but he was able to do it for many years. My brother did, so I found that kind of funny. But yeah, to me though, this whole age of video games coming to because basically back in the 80s, video games were obviously crazy popular. Arcades were everywhere, but there was that little bit of a die-off that occurred right around the time that you and I were born, and so the industry kind of took a hit for a little bit here. And now we see this resurgence in video game popularity occur roughly about 10 years later, which is still going even today. Yeah. It's kind of crazy just how that relevance is stuck around. But E3, this isn't really the popular part of it. They did have some issues with actually securing the space for where it was going to actually be held. And originally it was actually at the LA Convention Center, which was having crowds of about 40,000 people at the time. And then they had to move it to the Georgia World Congress Center a couple years later because of some kind of licensing issue or some agreement over it, which really caused E3 to then shrink in size for a few years.
Yeah, believe it or not, that Georgia place just not nearly as attractive as going to LA. So, yeah.
I mean, on its head, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you have the West Coast, which is an access point for Japan, for China, for some of these areas that have massive investment in the manufacturing sector. So to me, that doesn't really sound that confusing. But we're talking from roughly 40,000 people down to as low as 10,000 at one point. And part of the reasoning for that, Joe, is because of what we just mentioned a moment ago. These influencers were trying to make their way into E3 with these, fake credentials and everything. And We have to remember something very important about this era in human history, Joe, and that would be the pestilence known as the blogger.
Yo, the bloggers. Oh, the bloggers. I mean, I should like I should I shouldn't be so mean, because I remember I had to blog once for college when I did my student teaching in China. I was required to keep a blog, which was ridiculous. And mostly because I didn't think it was that entertaining, or didn't think it was that great, but that's apparently how they graded me. But for those of you who don't know a blog, the very first one was kept by one Doogie Howser at the end of every episode. He would just you'd see the clicking and the tapping of things that we did. And it eventually spiraled out of control to the point where one of the good things and bad things about the internet is that everyone has a chance to speak and everyone has a voice. And this is not me coming from like some sort of weird platform like, oh no, free speech is awful. No, free speech is great. However, not everything that everyone has to say is all that interesting, and not everyone's really good at talking to people at mass. So a lot of times what you get is mostly just trash, and that like someone may even have something genuinely interesting to talk about, but they can't do it very well, and that was like 90% of the blogs that were out there.
It's very true. I mean, I remember some of the earliest blogs that you would just see that your friends would be making and stuff like that. They basically felt like a graduated version of a Lisa Frank folder. You've got all these like early animated GIFs that are sparkling and ridiculous colors, and I'm sure dashboard confessionals in the background playing while you're at the website. But these were the people who were infiltrating E3, and I mean I can't see why that would be a good thing necessarily. I mean, the reach alone on those blogs could not have been that great, and so it leads to an investment problem, because you have companies who are paying millions upon millions of dollars to have spots at this expo, and then to be visited by someone who might have three people in their audience. Questionable investment.
Again, this is again, we're talking very early internet, at the point where like Mark was saying, like the reach isn't there. So it's kind of thinking of like how like today, like people can legitimately make money and make a living off of being like content creators and like putting their stuff on YouTube and having shorts every day, having regular programming, and like they can legitimately like make a living. When YouTube first came out, that was impossible. Like you couldn't do it. There was actually like a really great South Park episode where they were trying to raise money for Canada because Canada went on strike, and the way that to do it was to make YouTube videos and try to become internet famous. And the most they could get were I think Tim Hortons like coupons.
Yeah.
And that's what they were willing to give Canada because that's all they could get for all the work that they had done by trying to make Butters this internet star. And that's kind of what was going on with these vloggers, or these not even vloggers, just bloggers. Is they're out there, they're putting information of stuff they think that's cool, but no one's reading it. So it's a wasted money, because at that time, I don't want to say print necessarily, but even like, because you've got some web-based reading going on at the time, but no one was reading it if it wasn't coming from IGN or GamePro or a larger some sort of larger production.
No, I completely agree with you on that, and it's also a slot that a blogger's taking that a manufacturer might come and go, hey, I actually have legit hardware that would be great for your system, that could elevate what you're trying to do in the future. And I'm not saying they wouldn't be able to discover each other without that, but similar to the story of how we talked about Rare Corporation and Nintendo back in the early 90s. Rare got work outsourced from Nintendo for them to develop, and that's how that relationship gets formed. But when you have a convention network like this, the importance of having people who actually can work together and do these things, I would say, is far more important than someone who just wants the clout for whatever they think that is.
Absolutely. And to that reason, now I think we really should shift the conversation into the modern world, where now you don't need to have, or I guess individuals can become like a known establishment in themselves, where you can have it's your YouTube channel, and they want, since your channel's reaching so many people at very little cost to the event, is it worth having something like E3 anymore? Do we need these large events? Do we need this kind of convention in a time, oddly, where conventions are actually really big and very popular? Comic book conventions are still huge. They're massively popular. Fan expos or like pop culture conventions, they are really like they're still really big right now. But do we need a convention like E3 anymore?
Well, I think it's worth having a conversation behind how fandom has changed over time too. And part of the issue, I think, with E3 was that having an industry event that does generate a lot of buzz within the industry itself. So an event like E3, Joe, was worth it when these events were smaller and didn't really have a way to communicate with each other. But the door really did open for fandom to be a much better thing to be able to spread the word about these things than just the people creating the technology or the games, because obviously fans are the ones who spread the sentiment. You know, we're the ones that get ridiculous and dress up and cause the spectacle.
Yeah.
And so you could see that, Joe, over time, companies were like, we can make money off of this more than we thought we could. And so even with E3, towards its latter days, they were offering passes to people to buy that weren't industry professionals. From, I think, 2017 until the end of it, they were selling passes to regular non-industry affiliates. And so, I mean, I think that's really what happens, Joe, like right around the early to mid 2000s, and then especially about 10 years after that, fans are just showing that they'll open their pockets to this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Which is interesting, because you can take a look at like other conventions like kind of in the same realm as this, and like I think of things like BlizzCon, which this is like Blizzard kind of doing what every streaming service is now, where it's like, oh, my movies are going on a streaming service, how about I just have my own streaming service for my own stuff? And Blizzard does that long before that. But again, even this is something that was like massively popular, where you have like huge bands like doing benefit dinners, and basically not benefit dinners, but like a closing night ceremony where you had like Linkin Park played at this, Tenacious D played at this. You had really big bands headlining these things, and this is a show that just got canceled this year for no real reason. Blizzard just said they weren't doing it this year. We have no idea if they're coming back in 2025, mostly because like BlizzCon is like no stranger to canceling things. I think they've canceled. This is their 5th time doing it. The 2nd time doing it with no real reason. The more recent time in 2022 was to reinvent the con to be safe and inclusive as possible. And this was also at a time where the parent company Activision and Blizzard themselves were coming under fire from multiple employee discrimination lawsuits, to the point where that probably played a huge part whether or not the convention should go on, at least that year. But like you said, it's something that they opened it up and the fans kind of took it to themselves. Like cosplay was huge. Streaming it live from different channels was very, very big. But even then, like, I don't know, is this worth continuing even for Blizzard or any other company doing this? Or can they get away with doing things just online and having announcements being done that way? Who knows?
Well, we'll consider the what's kind of happening behind the scenes here, though. Now, a lot of these conventions, they obviously make money because they charge, admission. They charge a fee for that, but then they require people to pay for that space on the floor, and that's very cost prohibitive for a lot of people because you're not just paying for the floor space. You got to pay for the travel. You got to pay to get all your stuff there, and that's a bit of an undertaking. Yeah. So, in a time when when that was the only way to really get your word out, because I mean, if you remember when we talked to Al Lowe, when Nate and I did a couple years ago, he mentioned that the mid 80s, early 90s, they didn't have feedback for almost really any of the stuff they were making outside of the sales numbers. They didn't know what people thought of the games half the time. And so we get this influx of technology that I think really influences this. And what I think is the biggest thing to point out here is that as the dawn of the internet becomes to just set fire, whatever you want to call it. What that ends up doing is providing a platform for these companies like Nintendo, Electronic Arts, Sony, Microsoft. They can live stream their own announcements.
Yeah.
So that means that they can do these announcements, put it on their channels, and they can even capture the revenue from the announcements. I mean, why on earth would you want to go to a trade show to do that anymore?
No, it just doesn't make sense. It was something that was fun while it lasted, but in an ever-changing world where everything is just out there all the time and accessible whenever you want it to be, why make it so that you have to go to one thing in a big crowd of people to hear something you want that is just going to eventually get blasted out everywhere?
Hey, it's easier.
Yeah.
It's much easier for
easier.
companies to do that. I mean, I just look at it even within maybe even the last 10 or 12 years. When you think about even let's just use Ubisoft as an example. Joe, how many times did you learn about a new Ubisoft game because of a YouTube trailer and not because of it being announced somewhere else?
Well,
I mean,
as someone who's never been to E3, I've gotten all of my Ubisoft announcements from online.
Well, but that's exactly it, though. I mean, we no longer need the delivery method as much anymore. But there is another reason why there's a nail in the coffin of E3, Joe. And do you know what that may be?
It wasn't porn again, was it?
Not porn, but hey, it's one of those like gotcha questions, which is far more simple than you would probably think. It's COVID. Like literally with COVID, not just the video game industry, but so many others were trying to think of how can we take this event and make it virtual, and the majority of the time, it's shit. Nobody wants to attend a virtual conference because why would you?
Yeah.
Just send me the on-demand link. I'll check it out later.
Exactly.
So that's literally what ends up happening to E3, dude. Like at the very end of its time, people were just like, yeah, look, pandemic is here. I'm not going to pay you a ticket fee just to watch a video. And so that ends up leading to just the full-on cancellation of E3. And that's after 2021. Like there's no additional content from that point on. And Joe, that's why I'm not shocked that BlizzCon did the exact same thing. I mean, for most of the industry, they're probably thinking, we don't need to give you a reason for why we're not doing it anymore. No. This just makes sense.
We just know. Yeah, everyone understands it.
Yeah, like seriously, we're actually gonna assume that our fans and the people that pay attention to us are smart enough to go, just watch YouTube. We're done doing this.
We're doing it.
So.
Yes, and in an ever-changing world, we would like to thank you for continuing to listen to Digital Dissection Podcast, as we appreciate all the Dissection crew does for us week after week. Your support really does go a long way, and if you like this episode, check us out on YouTube, where we make weekly videos about our favorite things.
And we also love hearing from you, as always, so feel free to message us over at digitaldissectionpodcast@gmail.com or in our communities across social media. We love your ideas, suggestions, and, well, pretty much anything, so long as it's tastefully done. And until next time, pop culture nerds, keep on dissecting.